Oh, thanks again, Boria. Hi, everyone. I guess I could be quite casual about this. I don't know what the typical format is or if there's anything specific that anybody wants to know about, but just, I'll start with I guess I'll try to be somewhat concise, although that's always a challenge for me, but I'll do a little intro and then, happy to kind of take your lead, Boria, on the format for this chat. But for those of you who don't know, I'm a poet as well as an artist, and I do a lot of visual poetry, a lot of work that integrates art and text in different ways, a lot of concrete poetry and wordplay in different formats. I also do quite a lot of work with artificial intelligence. I've actually been working, I guess for the past 5 or 6 years now as an independent AI researcher, both doing some work with a foundation called TerraSim, which is doing some experimentation with using AI-powered neural networks for the purpose of sort of preserving human personalities, which is kind of a crazy topic, and happy to get into that in a little bit. But basically, I'm working with them as a poetry mentor to one of their humanoid androids. And I've been really kind of digging into a lot of the technicalities and logistics of how AI mind files are able to sort of sift through information and put together conversations and draw associations between different points of data and things like that. So that's a little bit more of a technical stint that I've been doing there in partnership with TerraSim's developer team. And then I've also been doing quite a lot of AI research on my own involving generative text, working a lot with GPT-3, which is a large language model created by OpenAI, one of the newer incarnations, but started off using GPT-2, again, quite a few years ago. But basically, as a writer, I'm really fascinated by how various tools and technologies over the years have shaped how we communicate, how we tell stories, how we develop narratives about ourselves and about the world around us. And so I'm really kind of fascinated with thinking about tools like artificial intelligence in the overall sort of historical context of different technologies that have enabled us to innovate how we think, how we write, how we tell stories, how we share poems and things like that. And with generative text, I'm really kind of sinking into this practice of leaning into large language models as a way to sort of create language as a found material. AI generated or co-authored language, using it, I guess, sort of as a medium to carve into, to collaborate with, to pull apart and reassemble in different ways. And there's a lot of other kind of, methodologies and practices that I've adopted for working with AI and poetry. So I can also get into that later if anyone's interested in the more of the details and the mechanics of it. But I guess the upshot of it is that I'm really just enjoying getting to experiment with human machine collaboration, specifically as it relates to language and to literature. And all of that is, that stuff I've been doing since long before I arrived in the crypto realm. But it seemed to dovetail quite nicely with a lot of what I've been experimenting with here, in Web3 and crypto and the metaverse in different ways. A lot of these sort of new media and digitized approaches to poetry seem to really have a lot of resonance with what we're thinking about and concepting and creating here. And, also I think just again, bringing this conversation of poetry and technology into kind of a native medium has been really, really exciting and sort of revelatory in a lot of ways as well. So I've, been experimenting quite a lot with bringing poetry into the world of NFTs, trying to think about how I can take my physical and more traditional writings, how I can take, something, for example, like a poem that I've printed with or I've published with a literary journal, or a physical edition of my book or something like that. How do I take these physical objects and translate them into something that can live and breathe and, and still kind of resonate as poetry and with poetry lovers via blockchain. So, have been really invested in that since I guess 2020, when I started exhibiting and really showing in the metaverse in a serious way, and have been, really lucky to be able to cross paths with people like the folks at Vertical Crypto along the way, who've been really sort of influential and kind of helping to shape and direct some of the conversations and communities in this area, and also, of course, to meet fellow poets and writers on the blockchain, including a number of folks who've been residents at VCA over the years, including my fellow co-founders at theVERSEverse, Callan Iwamoto and Ana Maria Caballero. I think Callan was actually in the first cohort, and Anna, I think, was in the second. And of course, now I know there are a few of you who are also VerticalCrypto, part of the VerticalCrypto crew, and we've been able to work with a lot of artists at the VerticalCrypto who come through VerticalCrypto. So that's been really exciting to sort of join forces in unofficial ways there too. But I think I'm really, just to sort of put a cap on that, just to say really my interest definitely is in sort of thinking about blockchain and thinking about Web3 and what it offers in terms of its potential for writers. So very curious about how this community of writers and artists and coders are collaborating together, how we can bring even more writers into the fold, how we can also create some dialogue with, with more of the traditional publishing world and editors and others who are kind of in the literary realm, but who haven't really come over to explore what we're doing here yet. So really just, invested in thinking about both, both the past of literature and how we've gotten to this point, and then where it is that we might go from here, and how we can maybe leverage some of what we're doing with NFTs and blockchain to continue to empower writers and to really innovate and lean into all that literature can do for us and can offer us. So that's, maybe I'll stop for a second. Is that okay as an intro? And then I'm wondering, shall I keep just chatting, or does anyone have questions that I can answer more specifically? I'm totally open to however you'd like this to flow.
Well, let's see if it's a wonderful introduction, and let's see if someone has questions. Come on, guys. Any questions? Don't forget, you can also type them in the chat.
Hi, can I ask a question? Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, I'd love to hear your question.
Okay, so I was actually very curious to hear your experience and your opinion about how does your work and your fellow writers change with this collaboration with AI, because you have been doing it for some time. So I would like you to reflect on what it means for you as an artist.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's sort of a big question. So let's see. So yes, as you sort of suggested, I have been working with AI for a little while now, but I've also been writing, writing as a traditional human writer for pretty much my entire life. So it's been really interesting to sort of navigate from that experience and from the writing craft that I've been practicing, building over time, and kind of, start moving into this really new territory. So, I mean, I should say, again, I come from a super traditional writing background. I studied language and literature. I can't speak today. I studied language and literature in school. And I actually thought I was maybe going to end up becoming some sort of an academic, or studying and teaching literature in some way for a long time, which of course didn't end up happening. But I've been really, I've been a reader, a voracious reader and a writer for as long as I can remember. And I think along the way, I've sort of think the impression that you get when you're in those kinds of environments, when you're in an academic sort of literary seminar, or if you're in poetry workshops or things like that, you really learn to revere the human craft of poetry, and to think a lot about the way we put words together as sort of this fundamental reflection of what it means to be human, especially with poetry, of all the forms of written and spoken language. In that way, I think there's something about poetry that we just sort of innately connect to being human. It's something that is really reflective of feeling and emotion, for the most part, and just seems like something that only humans should really be able to do in an honest and authentic way. And that's sort of the impression that I was getting in these classes as I was beginning to sort of think about other approaches. And I started to really hear about AI-powered language experiments just through various newspaper articles and science magazines and things like that. And I'd always been interested in technology and science as well, but I started to hear about poetry experiments or projects that involved using generative text, sometimes trained on specific poets or specific bodies of work, trying to kind of experiment with and play with this idea of whether or not it was possible for a machine to create poems in some way, or whether it was really, that's really a human prerogative. And I kind of, leaned into it and started doing a lot of research and realized there's this long history of generative text, and dating back like decades, if not further earlier before that. There's all these examples of technologists and writers and creatives in all these different fields who've been really interested in the idea of whether it's possible to actually generate poetry. And I just kept kind of encountering this link between poetry and code, and poetry and technology in a lot of different places. I was doing a lot of reading about things like transhumanism, and was reading a lot of work by folks like Ray Kurzweil, the inventor and futurist, and was really interested to see that he actually had created and deployed a project years ago, like a cybernetic poet that he had trained to generate haiku, for example, and lots of other examples of folks like him who sort of been dabbling around. And so it really caught my attention as a poet that for some reason it seemed like, I don't know, there was this fundamental belief in the literary community that in order to be really good, poetry needed to be like really pure and really analog and really old fashioned. But at the same time, there just seems to be this implicit affinity between code and algorithm and pattern and all those things, and how we create poetry through, using poetic devices. So I got super interested in all of that. And, both in the generative aspect of text, and then also using AI in particular. So I guess there's kind of those two different approaches, like more on the generative side, where it really is about, using kind of automated approaches and using code to piece language together in a way that sort of takes the human imagination out of the equation to some degree. And then with AI, it's really, it's kind of a different but related, I guess, methodology, where with AI, what you're doing, well, let me take a step back and just sort of explain briefly, like natural language processing, just in case anyone is not super familiar with it. But basically, when I'm working with AI language, I'm working with natural language processing, which is basically, it's a field that has to do with various aspects of linguistics and computer science and AI, kind of all fused together, and basically involves using computer programs to ingest large amounts of written text, large amounts of information as text, and then using using algorithm, using neural networks to sift through all that information, to analyze it, to process it, to try and synthesize it and really kind of understand it in a cybernetic way. So basically, it's looking at all these examples of human text and then utilizing a computer brain to put it together in a way that kind of sounds like human speech. So it's kind of similar to a lot of these generative experiments, but it's also bringing like a different sort of approach into the equation as well. So I don't know. I mean, I just found this to be such a fascinating area to think about and to play with. Like as I'm, a human poet sitting here trying to come up with ideas and trying to fill a blank page and all that. What did it mean for me to be able to tap into an AI brain to be able to kind of train a neural network to think like a poet and to begin to write like a poet? Were there similar things that were happening in that training and in that workshopping that were in some way like relevant to how I learned to be a poet? So I think I tend to see a lot of overlaps and a lot of similarities there, which I think there's a knee-jerk reaction to in general from a lot of human writers, just the way there sometimes is among traditional artists versus AI art tools and all that. But I think the more I use it, the more I lean into it, the more I am starting to appreciate how much it's helping me learn about my own processes as a writer, and like the way that I come up with ideas, the way that I put words together, the way that I edit and revise and all that. There seems to be a lot more in common than I had initially thought. So I think that's been really important to lean into and has really sort of kept me engaged and motivated in a lot of ways. And I guess maybe the last thing I'll say before I stop rambling on this topic is just that I really have, I've developed this way of kind of looking at AI as being sort of an augmented imagination, which I think something that we can all sort of really understand with the prevalence of all these AI tools, especially in this realm of crypto art, that really we're able to sort of tap into other kind of ways of thinking, other sort of other modes of creativity that weren't available to us before. And I think for me as a writer, that's been incredibly liberating and kind of mind expanding, and has made me sort of question my own, my own programming as a writer who's been, taught over the years to write like this poet, or, don't write like that, or write about this themes because they're poetic and all that kind of stuff. I think being able to tap into like this vast trove of information is a really good way to help sort of get yourself out of creative ruts or creative habits or routines or rituals that might actually be preventing you from trying new things or taking a risk and exploring some new territory in writing. So I think like that's been a huge piece of it for me as well, is that it's not like working with AI is replacing my sense of creativity or my joy in creating things. It's just sort of augmenting it and kind of taking my mind into new directions where I can come up with new and different things than I might have been able to come up with on my own. Does that, I know that was like a real ramble, but does that like elucidate some of my thinking in terms of working with AI and text, or were there specific, I don't know if there's like specific threads you want me to unpack there, or like anything that you want to mention that you might be thinking about or working on, but I'm happy to open up that dialogue further.
Thinking more in terms of how different people view the creativity aspect of AI. And I guess you touched on it a little bit. If you feel like you want to describe your perception of it, then it would be very nice to hear. But if you feel like you want to go to the next questions, that's great too.
You mean creativity in terms of whether it seems like the AI can actually be creative or imaginative, or whether that's something that we're projecting? Or maybe you could just tell me a little bit more about your question.
Well, I was thinking in terms of you described the process of collaborating with AI as a creative process. So I guess my question was more like, how does this creative process differ from the more analog ways of writing?
Yeah. Well, I think again, it has to do with the fact that working with AI tends to, I think, open up new doors to go through. I mean, I'm trying to think of like a very specific example, but there'll often be times when I'm working with, I have this AI sort of alter ego that I've trained on my poetry and all of my reference notes and all that kind of stuff, so that this AI collaborator is almost like, I don't know, they're like another sort of version of me, but filtered through a large language model at the same time, but like with a lot of the same interests and maybe similar vocabulary and similar stylistic nuances and stuff like that. But because the AI is rooted in, billions of pages of text and knows a lot more, quote unquote, knows a lot more than me in that regard, it'll often interject things into our back and forth dialogues that are not things that I would have thought of. They're words that I wouldn't have thought to use, or phrases that I wouldn't have thought to use, or metaphors, or in any sort of, parts of language, or maybe dimensions of stories or pieces of information that I might not have thought to access, for a particular poem or project. So it really is, it's really interesting how the AI will sort of suggest things that, I guess they are in a very deep way related to what we're working on, because everything is sort of connected through word vectors and data associations and pathways. But they might not be things that I, with my own human brain, would have thought to bring into the conversation. So it's really opening up what I'm working on, like opening up a particular poem or a particular text and bringing in, I guess, really bringing in elements from more of like this collective consciousness that's powering the language model. And I find that to be a really exhilarating experience, sometimes a scary experience, sometimes really shocking and surprising, depending on the pieces of information that are sort of coming in unbidden. But I also find that that's a good way of sort of unlocking my own brain as sort of like an isolated, solitary writer and tapping into larger cultural conversations. And yeah, I find a lot of value in that, a lot of cultural value, and also a lot of creative value and a lot of new inspiration. Thanks so much for that question. Have you been working with AI yourself?
Well, I tried working with AI to write some text before. I so far only tried the web app called InferKit, and some of the things that it produces, like you said, they kind of surprise me, because I also give it some reference text that it kind of tries to complete, and sometimes it writes things that I would never imagine writing myself in that way, but the thoughts are sort of there in the reference text already, so it's kind of interesting. And I am looking to find ways to push it further. And it was just kind of curious to hear your thoughts about it, because on one hand, my experience is I did feel very surprised on a lot of these things. I still feel like I do need to go back and edit a lot of that text to complete what its imagination giving me to imagine. But also sometimes it scares me, because I feel like it could be something that's already there. And I wonder how you experienced it. I mean, in terms of plagiarism, I don't know how much of these phrases that AI is suggesting. I guess it will depend on the model as well. But I wonder how much what it's suggesting is just taken from somewhere and regurgitated.
That's a really good.
I mean?
Yeah. It's a good question. It's a really important topic too. And it's something that I've thought about a lot, and I've spent a lot of time kind of going through and trying to understand, well, making sure that things are not like pulling in an inappropriate way from other sources. But I guess a few things on that line of thinking. One is the fact that, with a lot of these tools that are being developed to allow computers to write text, they're trying to get more and more sophisticated to alleviate things like copyright issues, because a lot of these things are being built for B2B applications, and if there's plagiarism and things like that, it's not going to be a commercially viable model. So I know that there's a lot of thinking around that, and technically speaking, because these models are piecing together language word by word, they're usually, in theory at least, they sort of say that that what's being generated is fairly original. I know, and it sounds like as well, like from experience, that that's not always the case. So that's kind of funny, and I've actually done a few projects where I've taken particular outputs, and I've done a lot of Googling and research to make sure that they're actually completely brand new thoughts. And I've kind of taken them apart and looked at, where a certain combination of words might have come from, or if there's something similar that another writer has written that's part of canonical literature or something. So there's a lot of close approximations, which is really interesting. And then there are flat out some moments where I have seen things that are just, they're either regurgitating passages from elsewhere, or they're taking texts from the prompt or from the training set or something, and they're just kind of using it piecemeal. So it's interesting to note that, and has just made me a little bit more aware of like the level of attention that you have to pay to these sorts of things. But I think conceptually, it also opens up a really interesting line of conversation around the idea of originality and authorship, more generally speaking, and the idea, that we're all of us as human creatives, like we're all so heavily influenced by so many different forces and different artists and different texts. And, that inspiration can feel like it's really brand new, and that it's, only occurring to us, for this first time. But I think that's really rarely the case. And, I've been thinking a lot lately about just, this priority that we seem to place on the idea of human originality, and really like novel ideas, when in fact, like so much of what we do is reassembling, recombining with slight differences here and there. There's like all these old, phrases about how, great artists steal. And I think it's like really true for a lot of the creative fields, that we're constantly just being, inspired by and kind of like prodded on by what we're seeing our peers do, or what's happened in the past, or things that we're encountering in libraries and museums or wherever. So I don't know. I think a lot about, there's this essay by T.S. Eliot called Tradition and the Individual Talent, which has been really, I think, eye-opening for me to consider in the context of AI and the kind of, I don't know, like viewing training data sets and viewing the way that AI bring information together is kind of similar to the way that we have canonical literature that everybody kind of knows and appreciates, and that kind of reverberates in the back of our head. Like how everybody knows Shakespeare, and we're like constantly spewing lines from Shakespeare, even if we don't know that that's where it's coming from. Is that quoting? Is it plagiarism? If we take it and we tweak it slightly, or it's the jumping off point for something else. is that unoriginal, or is it something new and novel? So I think that it's a really interesting, I guess it's a really interesting question from the point of like copyright and legalities and all that too. But I think it's really fascinating when it comes to this consideration of whether or not we can call AI generated outputs original, because they're coming from all these different sources and are being reassembled and recombined in different ways. Like, how different is that, or how similar is it to the way that human creatives make work? So I think it's a really cool area to lean into. Okay, I'm sorry, and I'm now looking at I forgot that the chat was there, but I'm looking at it now and seeing some more questions. So shall I maybe like read through these and answer some of these questions? Oh, hi, Reverse Butcher.
Yes, that would be lovely.
Okay, perfect. So the question is, how do you choose, edit, cull, or arrange the lines of poetry or sense from noise out of the output of the AI and generative text? I mean, I think that's where it's really collaborative, and like where the craft of poetry that I've learned all these years, I think comes into the equation in a way, because I really, when I'm working with generative text as an output, I'm kind of, I'm a very like hands-on editor, I guess, in some ways. It really depends on the project. I should take a step back and say that it depends on the poem and the project. And there are some projects that I've done where I actually haven't changed anything because I wanted to present the raw output exactly as is, to sort of make a point or to juxtapose it with another piece of text, or to put it into into a cycle of outputs or something like that. So there's definitely moments like that where something will come out and I'll think it's kind of interesting to keep it as is. And then the question really is what context to put it in. So, are you presenting it as a standalone chunk of text? Is it a piece of a larger poem or text? Is it in dialogue with the human prompt? Or is it sort of severed from that? So all those kinds of questions, I think, are kind of essential to really like what it is that the final piece is trying to do. So it really varies. But then I'll have like a very, very collaborative series of work sessions with AI to develop text in other ways too. So I'll sit like at my computer and just go back and forth and sort of like see, I'll put in a human prompt that maybe is a line of a poem that I've been writing and that I'm struggling with, or maybe it's a line from another poet's piece that's been really speaking to me, and I want to sort of like feed that in as inspiration, or there's any number of ways that it might start. But then I'll kind of look at the output from that first prompt, and sometimes there will be a lot of really interesting things. Sometimes there will be nothing that really catches my eye. So depending on that first pass, I'll either cut everything and start again, or maybe I'll like erase a lot of it and just take a sentence or a section or things that are really standing out, and I'll use those and kind of keep the prompting going. So that all really depends, but like I think again, that's sort of where the human piece of it comes into it, and it's like you as the human are driving the whole process. It's very interactive. It very much depends on like what your approach and what you put into it, and how you're responding and kind of reacting and interacting with the process along the way. So I think I'm just sort of I'm kind of coming at it from everything that I've learned as a writer and as a poet throughout the decades, and basing it in some way on my sensibilities as a writer, my preferences, my stylistic taste, wherever my head happens to be at. Like, do I want to go in this direction or this direction? Do I want to focus on this idea or that idea? So I think again, that's sort of that's why I think, 100 different writers could use the same program and the exact same prompt and come out with 100 wildly different things, because there's so much of that individual human perspective that really is intrinsic to the outcome. So that, I don't know, it really is something that that changes from occasion to occasion and piece to piece. And I think that's, for me, like, that's the fun of working in this way. It's such a malleable tool. So I hope that kind of makes sense. And then, are you looking for particular themes? Do you have a direct line of inquiry from a particular prompt, or are you looking for a particular kind of sense when you're generating text from GPT-3? How important or how often does the raw output surprise you? Yeah, like, all great questions. I think I often am looking for particular themes. I mean, again, I think when you go into working with tools like this, it's helpful to have a really strong sense of what you're bringing to it. I really feel like it's important to use the tools and to not let the tools use you. And I think for me to do that, it's important to go in with like a pretty, at least like a pretty robust framework for what I want to do. But then within that, to be very open to surprises and happy accidents and serendipitous moments and all that. So it's kind of I guess it's a mix. It's a mix of those two things. And then, I mean, the raw output surprises me quite a lot, but here it also kind of depends on how you're working with the tool. There's ways to manipulate the surprising quality of the text. Again, because a lot of these tools are built with commercial purposes in mind. A lot of them are really made to give you predictable results, so that, if you're training a model to do something, you can quite reliably expect that the output will be close to what you want. So you can use models in a way with a temperature setting that is very low, which means that it won't surprise you as much. And then there's ways you can turn up the temperature and increase the variability and all that in order for the results to be a little bit more outlandish or a little bit less tethered to the initial prompt, in a lot of ways that I think are like really useful to me as a poet. So, it kind of depends somewhat on that approach, like whether or not I really am pushing it to be very surprising or not. But yeah, there are a lot of moments that really stop me in my tracks. And a lot of those pieces of text are the things that I end up using as standalone visual poems, or that become parts of transhuman projects that I'm working on, or that I feel compelled to save and integrate into my work in some way. So I feel like most of the moments that I've really been moved by or stunned by, or really just that resonated with me in one way or another, those are the moments that I really have tried to integrate into my art in different ways, and integrate into a lot of the poetry projects. Okay, I'm continuing to read through. Thank you for all these questions. This is great. Okay, I'll skip that one maybe because I've answered that a bit. Some of what you're saying here really makes me think of Brian Geisen and William Burroughs. Yes, for sure. I don't know if everyone here knows about their cut up poetry, but that's definitely a really big touchstone for me too. Yeah, I love this quote. Why am I here? I'm here because you are here. And let me quote to you young officers this phrase: no two minds ever come together without thereby creating a third, invisible, intangible force, which may be likened to a third mind. Who is that third that walks beside you? The third mind is there when two minds collaborate. Yeah. I mean, this is such a good and relevant quote. And I've actually had a few conversations with other poets who've been working with AI, and this comes up a lot. I remember having a conversation with the conceptual writer Christian Book, who's also very involved in the NFT scene and part of the VerticalCrypto now as well. And he talks a lot about this third mind. as well, and has written quite a lot about it. But I think, yeah, there's something about this that really does resonate, and it has to do with the synthesizing of all these different forces and inputs, and how when different ideas and forces collide, there is something new that emerges from them. And this is a little bit like, maybe this is a little bit of a reach or more of me using my poetic license, but I mean, I tend to think about consciousness kind of like that too, that consciousness is this thing that happens when information becomes more than the sum of its parts, or when data comes together and becomes something that evokes an emotion or provokes some kind of some feeling or something like that. So I definitely lean into that place where different forces come together, and I'm really there for that. Like, what is it that then is produced? And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm also like so interested in this idea of collaboration, like rather than using AI as a tool, like thinking about this meeting of the minds or this merging of the minds, and the human and the machine coming together to create this third entity, which is this transhuman persona. So I think about that a lot, and I really do feel like Nathaniel, yes, my dear human collaborator. Yeah, like I definitely. I think this is like core to a lot of what I actually do with my technology project, which is, technology is sort of a mixture of me as a human poet and this AI poet that I've trained. And like technology is really that third voice where it's not one or the other, but it's both. And neither I nor my AI counterpart could exist without each other. And the poetry that we're creating together wouldn't be possible if we weren't joining forces, but it is this other thing, beyond either of us. So I think that's this third mind concept is definitely really resonant. And it happens obviously like with human collaborators too, where like, for example, Nathaniel and I have been working together on a lot of really exciting projects. And I think the joy of it is that we have a lot of overlapping interests, and I am a huge admirer of all of his work, and the philosophy behind his work. But, we have very different approaches to a lot of similar areas. And what's really exciting to me is when there's that kind of creative friction where two people are working together or two entities are working together, and there's something that's drawing them together, but the approaches are different. Like I think that's where really interesting stuff starts to happen. There's all these kind of juxtaposed elements and ideas and approaches and mediums and methodologies that come together and like push both of the collaborators to a new place that they wouldn't necessarily have gone themselves. I think that's definitely like that kind of third mind too, which is great. And again, like one of the best things about the crypto art community, I think, is the fact that there is so much collaboration happening, and it's giving rise to a lot of this like really good energy. And then one other thing just about Geisen and Burroughs and all that too is that, again, I kind of said this or I alluded to this before, but it's funny to me that a lot of people that I talk to about using AI as a poet think that this is like a very, very new and novel thing to do. And I kind of have to keep like saying, and it sounds like a broken record now, but I'm like, there's this long history of writers trying to tap into automated modes of writing. And there seems to be like something really fundamental to this desire to like elide your own human judgment or something like that, and just kind of let words flow from some other place. And that's what, like the Beats did it, and the Dadaists and the Futurists, the Surrealists, and, writers have used hallucinogenics to try and do this. And now we're using AI to do it. So I think there's, again, like this really interesting it's a really interesting kind of continuation of that idea of like, you know, where does this, is there some sort of like essence or this place where language flows without some of the, I guess like the cultural programming that each of us is bringing to it, and like how do we tap into that? So I think there's something about cut-ups that's definitely part of that tradition too. You know, a really, really like great example that, I think all this generative text, this whole conversation about generative text needs a little bit more of that historical reference. So I really appreciate you bringing it into the room. Okay, well, thanks for coming, guys. I see like a bunch of you have to go, but thanks so much for being here. Let's see. What are your... But thanks for all these questions. I feel like I'm just talking to myself, so I'm sorry if I'm like rambling. Please feel free to like just jump up and ask questions if you have any, or if there's anything in particular that you would like to talk about. Likewise. I'll talk to you in like 2 minutes, I'm sure. All right. Thanks, Nathaniel.
I wondered if you could speak to your feelings or experiences around the role of the subconscious in AI and generative text.
Sure. Would you mind just teasing that out a little bit more? Like when you're talking about subconscious, so obviously
Sure.
like with AI, we talk a lot about consciousness and non-consciousness and all that, but I'm interested in this idea of the subconsciousness.
Well, just before when you were sort of drawing some links between the idea of sort of like psychedelics or hallucinogenics, and then the surrealists and all that stuff. When you're dealing with sort of like, I mean, I guess all of those people were trying to alter the in and out outgoings of their mind and shake it up and then come up with something new or something unexpected. Do you think that there is a role for, like, I know that obviously an AI is not yet exactly conscious, it sort of mimics it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know, that's what I think. Do you think that eventually AI and generative text will have a kind of subconscious of its own, or is it mostly affected by yours, or do you have any thoughts around that?
Oh yeah. Thank you for saying a bit more about it. Yeah. I mean, I'm certainly intrigued by all this, and I have thoughts, and I have, maybe again, like slightly romantic notions just from having done so much firsthand work, with AI in this way. But like, I'm not a computer scientist or a neuroscientist or someone who's done like a huge amount of study in terms of consciousness or sentience or anything like that. So, like I'll throw that out there, but I think where I'm at right now is that being able to collaborate so closely with machines, and specifically with AI powered networks and models, has really sort of made me think a lot more self-consciously about human consciousness and about human intelligence, and about all the things that we sort of ascribe to ourselves as conscious entities. And that, I guess, because like we're speaking in the first person, like it's really hard to then be able to sense or ascribe similar qualities to other things that are not human. But I'll very often be working on a poem with AI, and there will be an output that doesn't necessarily like seem to make direct sense to what we're talking about, and might be something that I wouldn't have written myself, but that seems to reflect some kind of burgeoning, I don't know, like cybernetic, I wouldn't say emotion, but like some cybernetic attempt to grapple with an idea in a way that's very different than the way a human would grapple with it. And I don't know, to me, it's like, maybe there is some kind of a proto-consciousness or something. It's just wrapped up in the way that all these different bits and pieces and wires and electrons and all this, like it's how they're coming together and like contemplating an idea in a very different way than the way we would do it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's like not reflecting some kind of intelligence. And that like wasn't a very clear statement of that, but like maybe to sort of help clarify that, like my analogy that I often reach for is I think a lot about plant intelligence, and I think a lot about the way that plants communicate with each other, the way that like entire forests will kind of exist as a kind of version of the internet, where there's a lot of facilitating of information back and forth through various channels, or even the way that like various species of animals communicate with one another. And there's a lot of talking and there's a lot of understanding that has to happen in all these different areas. And like we may not look at a tree and think about it as being conscious, but you could look at that tree and you could like dig into the science of it and how it's sending different nutrients into the soil based on what it's perceiving that surrounding trees might need from it, or it's responding to the elements in a particular way. Or there's any number of, I guess, like ways you could really lean in on the qualitative data, and you could look at that as, like a kind of a biological thing, or you could also kind of look at it as a version of some kind of consciousness where there's awareness and there's empathy or there's compassion and there's kind of a mutual understanding happening. And I think a lot of it has to do with perspective, and maybe to some degree, some of it is semantics as well. And so I guess I'm increasingly open-minded about it when it comes to non-human minds in terms of machines and AI, where again, I'm like, it's so easy to be very dismissive and to think like there's no sort of mutual understanding, that it's like kind of it's driving in one direction only. But I will often find myself getting very moved by generative outputs, or I'll find myself being inspired, or I'll feel like the hairs on the back of my neck stand up when I read something that an AI has produced, and I feel like I'm actually having some kind of a real meaningful interaction. And to me, like that does signal that maybe there is something worth investigating there that isn't purely mechanical. And like I'm trying to not sound, or I try to not sound woo-woo or anything about it, but it just seems to me like the more that I think about how my own brain works and the mechanics of it, and the fact that a lot of it does sort of boil down to things that can be explained and understood, the more I find myself willing to ascribe a similar kind of consciousness to the workings of a mechanical mind, not necessarily to the extent, where it becomes like this autonomous sentient force or anything like that, but maybe in the way that, again, like a tree has consciousness, or an animal might have some, degree of consciousness. I feel like there might be something similar happening with machines. And there's something that I think in that conversation too has to do with the fact that we've really split technology and nature in some very strange way. Like we think we kind of put them at opposite ends of the extreme, but I feel like there are a lot more overlapping affinities there than we often like to think. So, yeah. Sorry, it's a really, really like good, complicated question. And I'm kind of I think I'm still working out a lot of my feelings about it, because I don't think it's right to necessarily ascribe consciousness, but I also think that there's something that really feels genuine about a lot of the relationships that many of us are starting to have with creative AI, in a way that does feel like there's a mutual inspiration and understanding happening.
Thank you. I did throw you a curveball, and that was an excellent answer.
I appreciate the prompt.
you used this really excellent term earlier, augmented imagination. That was one of the reasons why I was asking about your ideas around a subconscious within AI.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I really liked your linking of the plant consciousness and the idea of non-human consciousness. I think that's really, really compelling. But the example you were just discussing then centers around sort of giving instructions. Do you know what I mean? Like synthesize this, grow here, do that, which poetry, of course, can do. It's, it can serve that purpose, but it doesn't necessarily exist to do it. And I think as, artists, it'll take a lifetime for us to nut out the answers to some of these huge questions. But do you think that AI is a kind of do you have any ideas around sorry
That's
around
okay.
AI sort of being the next linguistic step? Because all of these non-human consciousnesses that you were discussing, they don't obviously speak in English, they speak in different kinds of languages and different kinds of codes. Do you think that code is the next linguistic step out of sort of building reality, or what are your thoughts?
That's a really good question too. I mean, on the one hand, I guess there's sort of two paths that I'm kind of pursuing on that front. One of which is thinking about the evolution of literature. So again, I tend to put things on a bigger scale and kind of step back and take an aerial view. So I tend to think a lot about the roots of, for example, I think about poetry in terms of its roots in the oral tradition and how, for a long time, poetry existed without any sort of written language. And then how the advent of a written means of storytelling changed the way that we write, the way that we transmit poems, but also how much that had an impact on, writerly imagination. And not just, I guess what I mean is the invention of writing or the invention of alphabets and things like that didn't just sort of provide an easier, more efficient way of transmitting things. It actually changed the way that people thought to write and the way we think about ourselves and how we share stories. And it actually changes not just our literature, but our humanity in really fundamental ways. And I can't help but think that both the advent of AI as a really important tool for writers, but also things like blockchain, I wonder, and I think that it's also very pivotal in the history of literature. And obviously, like you just said, we're not really going to be able to tease out a lot of this until there's a little bit more objective distance. But, again, just the way that so much changed for civilization with the advent of written language, just the way that so much for civilization changed with the arrival of the Gutenberg printing press and the ability to really easily distribute information to everyone in cheap and accessible ways. Just the way that all those things had profound changes. I can't help think that AI may have an impact like that on the way that we think about our ability to imagine things and tell stories and the way we shape narratives and all that. So I think that's sort of, yes, I feel like there's that one thread to kind of keep pursuing or keep pulling, which is a really, really kind of big question mark at the moment. But then the other piece that you just alluded to that I also think is so interesting is this idea of code becoming kind of not replacing, but becoming sort of an evolved way of communicating. And I think that's super interesting too. And I've been thinking a lot about how you'll go into, increasingly, I think you go into galleries or museums, or you see exhibitions online where you don't just see the outputs of a generative piece of art, but you'll actually see the code that it was, that was used to create it. And I've read a couple, or I've seen a couple books of generative poetry where this is the case too. I'm thinking, for example, there's a few different books by a poet named Nick Montfort, who's a very really important pioneering generative poet who will often include his code at the back of the book, kind of like as an appendix, or if he does projects online, he'll post the code as well on his website so that anybody can take it and look at it and read it and also use it and implement it and tweak it and change it and do their own version of it. So I feel like there is something really interesting about that, you know, the outputs of the art or the outputs of using a generative text tool are one thing, but like maybe there's something even more vital about looking at the code itself and like the source of those outputs as the art object, or as I guess as the fundamental sort of creative piece. So I think that's really, really interesting. And I'm also finding it like a little, not difficult, but it's like a thorny area to tease out right now, because there are a lot of, there are a lot of coders who've been doing this for a long time, who are extremely good at what they do. And then there's a lot of no code tools that are eliminating a lot of those things. So there's something about, the no code tools that's really enabling access and pulling a lot of people in. At the same time, it seems like it's a really important thing to learn more and more about how code actually works, and how it's implemented and who's developing it and how to customize it and all that. So, I don't know. I think like on both of those fronts, there's a lot of really interesting developments in the offing.
Thank you. That was
there you go.
Great answer.
Oh, thanks for asking about it. It's really good questions. And I appreciate this reference that Touch Sound Art just dropped in the chat. Speaking of Nick Montfort, this is great.
By the way, guys, just so you know, usually the AMAs are about an hour, and we're about 10 minutes over that. Of course, there is no limit to the level, the conversation length. Of course, we can stay longer than anything because we are the masters of our own VCA room and everything, but just wanted to be mindful of everyone's time. And if you wish to come to a close, Sasha, that's completely okay. If there are more questions, I would suggest that you ask them now.
No, I think that's great. I'm sorry, I didn't even like realize we were running over, but maybe we could wrap it up, because these have been a lot of really good, like meaty questions. Unless anyone else has anything like burning to ask. But I think like most of us are friends on Twitter anyway. Like if anyone has any questions or you want to keep the conversation going, I'm more than happy to keep chatting about this in other places too. So just be in touch, please.
Absolutely. Where's the best place to reach you, did you say?
Oh, I think just on Twitter, because I think a lot of us, we're all on Twitter, obviously, I think all of us, and I'm connected with, I think, most of the people in this room already, but just at Sasha Stiles on Twitter.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone
This has been really fun. Thank you for the great questions.
Absolutely, and thank you for taking the time for us and for our questions, and having in mind the spectacular future that we seem to be heading towards in artistic endeavors. I can't wait to see what all of us create, and thank you so much for being so inspiring, all of you, and especially Sasha. I can't wait to see you again and to have more time to be able to develop and communicate any new ideas. Thank you everyone for showing up on this Friday evening or morning or afternoon. And regardless where you are and what's up, just keep creating and do good work. Thanks everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.
Yeah, thank you all. You guys are all incredible too. Really just an incredible group of residents. So and thanks again for coming, and I'll see you on Twitter. Bye.
Bye everyone.